A warning, the following is going to contain some spoilers, so if you haven't played the game or you don't know what's going on, please don't watch this video as I don't want to ruin anything for you. But if you wish to know more, please continue on. The game Visage is a very in-depth and interesting story. The game itself is absolutely horrific. It is very intense, it is very stressful to play, but it is an extremely good game and it's a lot of fun. In this video, I want to talk about some of the theories to fill in some of the gaps that may not be already apparent. Now, I'm not going to go too much into the backstories of the other tenants that were involved in the game or the chapters that you go through as you're being Dwayne, but I will give a quick summary of what we do know. So what we do know is that you are a character named Dwayne, who at the beginning of the game winds up killing his family and then killing himself. Right after that event, he wakes up on the floor of his house and starts to quickly experience paranormal activity. He starts going through the chapters of each individual tenant that used to live in the house and experiences their horrific tale of the end of their life. What we do know about Dwayne is that he worked basically as a scientist for the CIA for about 3 decades. And what it appears is that he started roughly around the 60s, and he was hired to conduct experiments on the civilian population. So what we do know is that there are 4 tenants of the house before Dwayne moved in. In the 1960s, the first tenants were Lucy and her parents. Then after that, we had Dolores and her husband. And then after that, we had Lewis. And then after that, we had a man named Rakan. Now, Lucy was a little girl who was described as a bit of a loner in the game. It's possible that she suffered from depression, and it's possible that she might have been slightly autistic. Now, remember, in the 1960s, they didn't have a term for autistic. They just referred to them as special, or that they had mental disorders and they needed treatment. So any sort of position on the autistic scale wouldn't be really recognized right away as being autistic. So if Lucy was just slightly autistic, they would just see her as a somewhat normal girl, but just slightly different. So Lucy, while living in the house, started to have an imaginary friend who she interacted with. And the imaginary friend would start telling her to do bad things, which she would comply with. This would result in her eventually biting off and eating the head of her own pet bird. At that point, her parents felt that she needed extra help and started sending her to doctors for treatment. This only made it worse and eventually resulted in Lucy having a complete mental breakdown where she ripped off her own jaw. After Lucy, Dolores moved into the house with her husband and child, supposedly. Now, Dolores was an elderly lady who suffered from schizophrenia. Prior to moving in, she had some form of schizophrenia, but she was being treated. However, shortly after moving into the house, her schizophrenia started getting worse and worse until the point where she became very violent and ended up killing her husband and then hanging herself. Whether or not a child actually existed is up for debate. Dolores did suffer from schizophrenia and could have imagined the whole thing, so for you running around trying to get her baby back might have just been a imaginary part in her brain thinking that she had a child, when in fact she never did. After Dolores, there was a man named Lewis. Lewis was a tenant of the house, and you don't really go into his story too much. But what you do find out is Lewis is the goo man, and he shows up later on as you go through the tapes to get the mask. Now, what you do find out is Lewis at some point used to work at the same water treatment plant that Dwayne did. And Lewis wound up finding out what was actually going on with the testing of the LSD or possibly MK Ultra on the civilian population. It seems that Lewis confronted Dwayne at some point and eventually wound up missing. And it's quite possible that Dwayne or the CIA themselves, someone, made Lewis disappear. Now, it's kind of indicated that Dwayne himself made him disappear by throwing him in a well, but it's quite possible that Dwayne might not have done it himself, but had turned him in and let the other agents deal with it. After Lewis, a man named Rakan moved in. Now, Rakan is an ex-rugby player who suffered from scopophobia, which is a fear of people watching him. He suffered from severe paranoia. And it's quite possible that Rakan was actually a normal guy who developed this shortly after he retired from rugby because he had an undiagnosed brain injury after playing rugby for so long. Now, because of his paranoia and his fear, he eventually wound up thinking someone broke into his house, which resulted in him shooting his gun and getting himself locked up in a mental hospital. Now, it appears that Rakan was in this mental hospital for a very long time. And what we do find out is at some point, Dwayne was involved in Rakan's treatment. While Rakan was in the hospital, he tried to escape by jumping out of a window, which resulted in him breaking both of his legs. So for the rest of the point, he had to walk around with crutches. This also resulted in him being unable to escape and leaving him in this mental hospital for an undisclosed amount of time. And when I say an undisclosed amount of time, I get the feeling that Rakan was in there for many, many years. Eventually, Rakan succumbs to the treatment, becomes extremely docile, and they decide they're going to release him. Once Rakan hears the news of him being released and going back into regular civilization, he gets back into his paranoia and states that he's going to sell out the company or the CIA or whoever, and that he has all this information about them. That's never really a good thing to announce, and Rakan eventually gets thrown into a cell and goes missing for the rest of his life, or end of his life. And this results in eventually Dwayne and his family moving into the same house. And from that point on, Dwayne gets into drinking and pills. His family notices the change. He appears that he's depressed, and he can't say anything about it because he signed a non-disclosure agreement for his job. This eventually results into the actions that you witness at the beginning of the game. Dwayne ends up killing his family and then killing himself. Now, Dwayne is a very religious man. There's a lot of religious statues and crosses all over the house. Dwayne appears to be a Catholic, and in Catholicism, not only do they believe in heaven and hell, but there is a special thing called purgatory that only Catholics believe in. Now, purgatory is the area in between heaven and hell where you try to pay for your sins. You're neither severely good or you're neither severely bad, but you do have to pay out your sins in order to go to heaven or to hell. The theories I have about this game fall into these categories. All the tenants were suffering from some sort of mental disorder, and that is why they were affected the most. A lot of confusion was, why did Lucy suffer and her parents didn't? And that theory goes back to she had a mental disorder and her parents didn't. So when they were consuming the LSD, they weren't as heavily affected as Lucy was. And the other thing I want to talk about is Lewis. Lewis confronted Dwayne about his actions, and I think it affected him more than the game lets on. This is the way it happened. Dwayne gets the job. He starts working on the experiment, and everything is going fine. He thinks he's changing the world, as some of the scenes indicate, and he thinks he's doing a good job. And eventually, after Lucy and Dolores and some of the research comes out, Lewis finds out all the nitty-gritty about it, and Lewis then confronts Dwayne. Now, Dwayne didn't realize the damage that he was doing. He's only doing what he's been told. And when he's presented with this information, he knew he had to do something. He didn't want to go to jail. He didn't want to get in trouble, which is probably what he feared what was going to happen. Now, Dwayne either informed his superiors about Lewis, or he took care of the problem himself. Either way, now Dwayne has the weight of the knowledge of what his experiments have done to people. He now knows about Lucy, he now knows about Dolores, and now he knows about the countless other people that have suffered from his direct interaction with the experiment. Which brings us to Rakan. The experiment was going to continue. With Dwayne or without Dwayne, the experiment was still going to continue because the powers that be above him would have had it. However, I believe that Dwayne was so shaken after the confrontation of Lewis and the information that he asked to be taken off the project. Obviously, they weren't going to let him go because he knew too much. So they just transferred him over to the mental hospital. And that's where he comes into contact with Rakan. And I think this is where the actual downfall of Dwayne's mental health really kicks in. I think Rakan was the first actual face he saw and interacted with and showed him the results of his experiments. I think the weight of seeing how this man suffered from his direct actions tore Dwayne apart. And this is when his drinking and his drug addiction started. After Rakan disappeared, Dwayne and his family move into the house. There's nowhere Dwayne can move in this town that he doesn't know what has happened to the tenants before. So this just happens to be the house that Lucy and Dolores and Rakan lived in. As his mental state declined and declined, he started getting worse. Now he's starting to get a mental disorder. And he's living in the town and consuming his own experiment, which then leads down the same route that Lucy, Dolores, Rakan all took. He now goes into his tirade, he's completely lost his mind, and he winds up killing his family and killing himself. And I think that's the gaps that haven't been explained in all the other stories, is the fact that Dwayne tried to get out, couldn't get out, was confronted with his experiment face on with an actual person, and it drove him insane. And then when he moved into the town, because he probably felt guilty for everything that he did, he started to succumb to the actual experiment being conducted, and he started consuming whatever they were putting in the water, which then sent him down the line of the ending of the game, which is basically killing his family, killing himself, and then living in purgatory to try and confront what he had done. And whichever ending you get, that's the way it goes. You have the hell ending, basically, where he gets thrown into the well and he suffers there for all eternity, or the good ending where he finally accepts it, he forgives himself, and he moves on with his family to heaven. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you have any other observations or theories, please feel free to share them. I hope you guys enjoyed it. This game is phenomenal. I suggest if you haven't played it, please do. If you don't know what I'm talking about in a lot of them, there are other story videos where the game is explained. I suggest going back and watching them. That would be super beneficial to see how Dwayne connects to the residents, and the residents, how they suffered from the testing, and how you even knew that the testing was going on. So please watch those videos, come back to the theory, see if you agree with me, and I hope you have a great day. Be safe out there.